Hi, Crushes and Taxes family. It's Rebecca Walser. So glad to be back with you. Was out for 4th of July week, and I'm a little under the weather. You can hear it in my voice. So my apologies. I want to do a brief podcast today about some alarming trends that are occurring in our country. And I want to encourage you to turn off the podcast immediately if you're not interested in hearing anything about laws, politics, parties, Congress, this administration, tax policy, inflation, and etc. The full name of our podcast is Crashes, Taxes, and Politicians. A lot of people forget that that's part of our title. I got one listener once who wrote and said, if I wanted to get advice, political advice from my financial advisor, I wouldn't. I have to say that was pretty funny. But you know what? I have free speech, and I'm going to use it as long as I have it. Because Lord knows in the last 18 months, we've seen the most censorship that we've ever seen in the history of our country. We also see a lot of people that are talking about other people's opinions as dangerous and threatening and scary. And I don't believe any of that. I think that's a bunch of poo. And the reason I think that is because as a lawyer, you're trained that robust debate and conversation actually leads to the best possible solutions. So when we stifle debate, when we stifle public opinion that we don't agree with, we're just getting a bunch of groupthink echo chamber, and we feel really good about ourselves because we think everybody thinks the way we do. And what we've really just done is just stifled what a lot of people think that just can't say it anymore. So I want to talk to you specifically about what's been happening in the last 6 weeks in this country. And specifically, I want to address that we are talking about a 3.6, and I'll put very loose quotes around this infrastructure package, 3.5 trillion infrastructure package that this administration apparently thinks they can get through budget reconciliation. Now, I need you to understand that there's a separate $1 trillion that is specifically being earmarked for bridges, roads, infrastructure that you and I would normally think as infrastructure. That is a separate bill. So this 3.5 trillion bill that is apparently going to be passed through a budget reconciliation is a lot of other things that this administration and this Congress on the Democratic side wants to get through. And I want to put this in perspective for you so you can really understand. Today, in July, we have just under $29 trillion of federal debt. If you go back in history, you'll understand that debt for the United States is a relatively new concept in that we were on the gold standard really all the way until Richard Nixon finally put the final nail in the coffin in the 70s. And so when Ronald Reagan in 1981 in January took office, we did not even have $1 trillion of debt yet. It took all the way till October of 1981 to get to $1 trillion debt level. And then, since then, Ronald Reagan, that was in October of 81, $1 trillion. Ronald Reagan, who was personally impacted living in California as an actor by excessively high tax policy. You can go back, this is public fact. He stated unequivocally on the record that he would not make 3 movies, he called them pictures, a year, because by the time he made the third one, he would be getting about 6 cents on the dollar, meaning that between the California state income tax scheme and the federal income tax scheme, he would only be getting about 6 cents on the dollar. And so he very clearly had tax as an important reform that he wanted to make when he went into his second term. So the reforms that Reagan implemented in 1986, passed by Congress, went into effect in 87, did something very unique. He dropped the top rate from over 50 active earnings, 70 passive. He dropped it from those high levels to 28%. So he gave us a massive tax cut, brought the top rate down to 28%. The top rate had not been lower than 28% in 1987, all the way back to 1935 under FDR. That's how long in the history we had to go back to find a lower top marginal bracket of 28%, 25% FDR 1935. So Reagan widened the tax brackets to assume more people at the top rate. So in other words, he narrowed the people in the non-top brackets so that people could get into the top bracket of 28%, basically if they made $28,000 as a family or more. So a lot more American people fit into that top bracket. So he widened the amount of people that went into the actual top bracket by actually narrowing the brackets above it. And so a lot more people fell into the top bracket. And he did this at a time frame where we didn't have a debt problem. And I certainly don't blame Reagan. I know where his heart was. But what has happened over time is that Reagan really started out for the first time as a presidency that could grow the debt. And he cut taxes. And so what happened was we got addicted to this capital because we were the world's reserve currency, the US dollar. There wasn't a lot of bilateral trade, for example, between the BRICS countries. So China and India weren't trading in their domestic currencies. They were having to buy dollars to bilateral trade between those two countries. What we're seeing now is we're moving away more and more and more from needing to trade in dollar bills. And so the less people need the dollar to execute bilateral trade, the more irrelevant the dollar becomes. And that is a huge concern because if you look at how much money we spend a year versus how much taxes we collect, there is a huge difference. And how do we finance that difference? We finance it with selling our dollars around the world because we are still today the world's reserve currency. So fast forward in my story, and you see that in July of 2021, we are just under $29 trillion of federal debt. $29 trillion of federal debt when it took us from October of 81 till this point to accumulate 29 trillion. Now let's put that into perspective. Last year, because of the coronavirus shutdown, we passed 3 legislative acts: the CARES Act, the HEROES Act, and ARP in March of 2021. Those 3 acts together are approximately $6 trillion of spending. The Federal Reserve has been stimulating us at a clip rate of $120 billion per month, 40 in mortgage-backed security and 80 in treasuries. This is what we call quantitative easing. In other words, we're selling our debt and we are buying our own debt. That is the definition of quantitative easing, where you're selling and you're buying your own treasuries. And we're doing that at a clip between that and the mortgage-backed security purchases. We're doing that at $120 billion per month still. And that is a stimulus of $1.3 trillion per year. So this takes us to close, since coronavirus started, actually we're over it now. We're about $8 trillion of stimulus that has gone in to stave off a Great Depression, which I'm not saying I don't agree with that. I think a Great Depression would have been way worse. But I want you to understand, if we spend about $8 trillion since March of 2020 to combat the shutdown and the economic impact, when you have spent $8 trillion to avoid the depression that would come in the event of shutting down an economy without stimulus. And now we're looking at this administration wanting to pass another 3.5 infrastructure deal on top of a separate 1 trillion that is earmarked for just bridges and roads and those upgrades that we need, which I'm not disagreeing that we need them. You're talking about 11 to 12 trillion dollars of spending that is occurring in the last 15 months. Now, if you put that in the perspective of the fact that we have only accumulated about 29 trillion since 1981, which literally is 40 years ago. So let's just do the math. 29 trillion divided by 40 years is about $730 billion a year. 29 trillion, 81 to 91, 91 to 2001, 2001 to 2011, 2011 to 2021. That's 40 years. 29 trillion in 40 years. It's not even $1 trillion a year. And in the last 15 months, we're talking about spending nearly $12 trillion. Now, even if you want to exempt out Corona and say, well, Rebecca, you can't count that because that's unfair. That wasn't something that anybody expected. Granted, I agree. But doesn't that mean that we as citizens should become a lot more responsible with any programs we're passing in the very next congressional session? Because we have just put our entire future, our children and our grandchildren's lives on the line, because money does not grow on trees. Money grows by taxpayers. Taxpayers pay the bills. And I want to tell you, as you all know, I am in the Global Executive MBA program at the London School of Economics in conjunction with NYU and HEC, which is HEC in Paris, 3 global MBA programs. And I just was in my class for risking the bankruptcy risk, assessing the bankruptcy risks of corporations. And my program is so awesome that we had the world-renowned inventor, creator of something called the Z-score. The Z-score is the Altman Z-score, which basically uses statistical regression analysis to determine the mathematical probability of a corporation going into bankruptcy. So we had the legend himself teaching us. And I was struck by the class because what he talked about was how you grade the solvency of a country is based off of a couple of things. Believe it or not, they actually do look at how much of a population we have. They actually do look at our mortality rates. And they actually do look at the overall health of the economy to be able to ascertain how much taxes a populace will be able to maintain over the long haul. That's how they grade the risk of a country. So if you don't think that we are subjugating our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren to the highest taxes you could ever possibly imagine while we spend money like it is water through our hands, I don't know what's going to wake you up and make you realize that that is exactly what's happening. We are enslaving future Americans with the debt that we are spending now. And I thought it was bad enough to have almost $30 trillion of debt before the baby boomers are about to retire in these next 7 years, because that in and of itself is going to be a sea change of tax policy. Don't get it wrong. We have 65 million boomers that are going to that are right now supporting and paying in, that are going to retire, stop paying in, and then they're going to rightfully go into Social Security and Medicare themselves. That is a swing in a country of 360 million people, of 130 million going from paying to receiving in just the next 7 years. This is the kicking the can down the road event that we've all heard about our entire lives, that Congress never had the guts to do anything about. And now we have an administration that's pushing a $3.5 trillion package through reconciliation. Now, something you should know about reconciliation. Reconciliation requires a dollar-to-dollar offset. So if they're going to pass $3.5 trillion of government stimulus or spending through reconciliation, they're supposed to be able to earmark and cut $3.5 trillion from other places. This is why when Trump passed his tax cut plan through Congress, it had to sunset on the personal side, because the tax cuts were so great that if they didn't sunset it on a certain date, specifically December 31st, 2025, it would cause too much budget problems and it would not be able to go through reconciliation. So we're going to see if we can come up with $3.5 trillion of spending cuts in other places. But I want you to understand that we just got, with this ARP, automatic child tax credits of $300 per child under 17 per family under a certain income level. You combine that with the stimulus that the federal government's been giving people that were not working through Corona, and you're starting to see an entire group of the population that could potentially stay home, not work, and basically be paid by the US government not to work. And that is a very big concern for me, because as an economy, when you start to get people that have no incentive to work at all. Now, let me just say, it's very common that the government can pay you a little bit to keep you out of poverty, to keep you going for a little while, right? And then you get back on your feet and you go back. But if you stay and you choose, if we have an entire population or group of people that chooses to stay at home because they're getting this credit, that credit, or whatever, what they're not doing is the normal career life cycle, which is going out and getting that job to start. Maybe it doesn't pay that great, that the government could pay you the same to stay home, which is not American capitalism as I know it. But that's all they can afford to do. They can't afford to give you a raise or a promotion or anything like that. So understand that for this entire group of population that would normally be in starter positions that would grow into management and grow into something further, that's not going to happen, because instead they're just going to sit at home and basically collect a check to not work from our government. And that means they're settling for that entry-level position and never really developing their career as they could. I'm not talking about the people that need genuine help, that are disabled, that cannot work. I think our society needs to be fair and equitable and needs to take care of its own. And I think we should certainly be taking care of poor American children and veterans before we're sending a bunch of aid to the entire world. If we can't even take care of our own people, how are we taking care of everyone else? This is part of the problem as to why we have $29 trillion of debt. So I just want to wrap this up in conclusion by saying that I am finding that we are at a tipping point in this country. And if we don't get this resolved and rectified, it's not the country that we built. It's not the country that millions of people died fighting for freedom, not only in World War II, but in the Civil War and the American Revolution. We have fought for our ideals throughout the generations. And I am going to be so upset if we're the generation that messes this country up forever for the future. So I wanted to share these thoughts with you because this $3.5 trillion is coming up very fast, and I'm speechless on the size of this package. We need to take a pause. We need to stop and sit back and ask for hard data. What kind of tax level is going to be expected of the next generation and even us? I'm not going anywhere for 50 plus years, God willing. I don't want to be paying 90% of my income to taxes. But this is the level that we are at. Between the retirement of the baby boomers and the massive spending that is coming out of proposals of Washington, D.C., we have lost our way, and we better find it really fast or it's going to be over. We will not be able to consistently borrow and borrow and borrow and borrow based on the size of our population and the calculations that they do to figure out how much taxes they can extract. It's time for us to stop, think about what we're doing, and demand from our government the ability to give us future projected tax rates after the baby boomers retire by person, by income level. Because when you start to see those numbers, you'll realize what I've already realized. We're at the end. Until next time, my friends, Rebecca Walser, take care.